Welcome to A Slice of SEL, a podcast for educators about social emotional learning.
Welcome to A Slice of SEL. We're the SEL services team at the St. Croix River Education District. I'm Nick.
I'm Rye.
And I'm Courtney.
This week we're talking about emotional intelligence, sometimes called emotional literacy. This is a skill set that makes it possible for our students to recognize, to label, and to understand their emotional experiences. It's also a big part of empathy, and sometimes we call empathy feeling with someone. And emotional intelligence isn't all of what social emotional learning is, but it's a big piece. It's right there in the name, social emotional learning. It's also a big topic that we can't completely cover in one episode. So FYI, this episode is really going to focus in on visuals and tools that we use to build students' emotional vocabulary. So examples of this are Yale's mood meter, the zones of regulation, the 5-point scale, or even just a simple list of vocabulary words.
But before that, let's talk about what's filling our buckets this week. Yesterday, I got up early and I watched the sunrise, and it's just such a good reminder of how something so simple can bring so much gratitude for the rest of your day / week. So I was just the beautiful sunrise and the beautiful weather just really gave me so much gratitude yesterday.
I think that's a great reminder, right? Just those small things that fill our buckets that we should just pause and appreciate.
Yeah, I really did enjoy the silence as well.
So peaceful.
What's filling my bucket is I'm just finishing my spring break as we're recording this, and I'm just very grateful to have had a few days to recharge.
Awesome, Nick.
So thoughtful of you to join us on your spring break to record our podcast, Nick.
You're so lucky.
Little button on the end of the week.
And then for me, I finished my bathroom over my spring break. That got done on Tuesday. It turned out so good, better than I thought it was going to, actually. It just looks like it all came together, and I'm thrilled.
It's gorgeous.
It really does look good, Court.
Thanks. Love it. All right, so shifting to our main topic, we're going to be talking about emotional intelligence. Specifically, we're talking about visuals and other tools that we use to teach students emotional vocabulary. So first, we're going to spend a couple minutes talking about why we do this and why it's so important. And then we'll talk about several different examples of visuals and other tools that we use to accomplish what we're talking about. And then finally, we'll talk about how those tools are used in classrooms across the country every day.
Thank you, Court. So focusing on the why for a moment, one thing I often like to say when we're talking about emotional intelligence or emotional literacy is that emotion is a central part of the human experience. So at our core, we're emotional creatures. We have a biology, we have these hormones flowing through us. And unless you're a Vulcan or a Terminator or some other kind of robot, you're going to have an emotional experience. I think it's always there for everyone. And it's really about how much we interact with that emotional experience, how we interface with it, how much we choose to acknowledge it and recognize that it's there and that it is influencing our thoughts and our choices as far as our behavior is concerned. So one analogy that I've used before is that our emotions are like a river. It's always there, it's always flowing, and sometimes we put some distance between ourselves and that river, like a frozen sheet of ice, for example, that we can walk over and pretend that the river almost isn't there. But sometimes the river is so strong that it pushes through that barrier and almost takes over. So that's not a perfect analogy, but I hope you appreciate it from some angles. But at least for me and some that I've spoken to in education, it does help to answer that why. Why is it so important that we prepare our students, the children that we're all raising together, to be emotionally intelligent and have some literacy to describe and recognize their emotional experiences? I think it's not ideal to always describe things in terms of control, like either I have the control or my emotions have the control. It's kind of unnecessarily adversarial. But I think it is fair to say that if we don't prepare our kids to be self-aware of that emotional experience that they're going to have as emotional creatures, and not give them the tools to be able to identify and describe what those hormones are doing to their brains and their bodies, they're going to be in less control of their moods and their choices. They're going to be running more on autopilot, you might say. They're going to be more reactive.
Yeah. Emotionally intelligent kids who grow up into emotionally intelligent adults aren't automatically happier more of the time, but they do have that skill set that allows them to thoughtfully respond to their emotional experiences with more intention. We're not teaching them that it's wrong to feel any particular emotion. I'm not going to ethically teach a child that it's wrong to feel sad, for example. Again, we're not talking about mind control our kids or teaching them that they have to smile and feel happy all the time. Instead, we're preparing them to deal with whatever emotions they experience and have more control over whether they continue to feel something or shift their emotional experience.
So we do want to get into some of the tools that we use in schools to increase students' emotional vocabulary. And I think one of the simplest examples is just giving kids a list of emotional vocabulary words like frustrated, anxious, joyful, ecstatic, whatever is age appropriate. And then we often accompany these with definitions. We talked earlier on our podcast before about how much emotional intelligence is already baked into the curriculum for, English or literacy.
Yeah, and I think I've mentioned a couple times, especially when I got into middle school and high school, our teachers told us that in order to be really successful writers, we needed to have that complex emotional vocabulary. So we need to have more sophisticated ways of expressing ourselves than saying, for example, a character is very, very sad, when we could use a word like morose or disappointed. So that's just one link we brought up before between, the idea of emotional intelligence and that emotional literacy, and just when we're digesting literature that others have written or when we're writing on our own, we need to have that emotional vocabulary.
Yeah, but beyond that simple list of vocabulary words, though, there are several visuals that are popular in schools. I think the really valuable thing about any of the tools we'll talk about is that they communicate something about the meaning of the words to students without having to read the definitions. If I try to rote memorize a list of words and their definitions, it won't tell me as much about the nature of what those words mean and how they reflect my experiences as some of those visuals might.
Right, and to really illustrate that point, Court, the first thing we're going to talk about is Yale University's mood meter. So if you're a regular listener of the podcast, you've heard us talk about the mood meter several times before. It was created by Dr. Mark Brackett and his fantastic, brilliant team of people at the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence. And what they've done is create this beautiful, very elegant visual that takes all this complicated science about emotions and really boils it down into a really simple visual. And just like Courtney was talking about, it provides some meaning to those emotional vocabulary words without having the definitions at hand. So the mood meter has two axes. The vertical axis is energy, and it goes from extremely low energy on one end, where you're almost asleep, to on the other end, the most energetic you've ever been, where you're jumping up and down and bouncing off the walls, that kind of energy level. That's the vertical axis, energy. The horizontal axis is pleasantness. So going from the most unpleasant emotion you could ever have all the way up on the other end to the maximum pleasantness that you could have. It's essentially how good you feel, that axis. So when you take those two things together, energy and pleasantness, you end up with 4 boxes or quadrants in this mood meter. So the bottom left is a blue quadrant where we have low energy, low pleasantness emotions like sadness, disappointment, misery, disgust. The top left quadrant is red, and this would be high energy, low pleasantness emotions like anxiety or worry or anger, rage, frustration. The top right quadrant is yellow, and this would be high energy, high pleasantness emotions like happiness, joy, excitement, feeling ecstatic. The bottom right quadrant is green, and this is my favorite place to be, and this is low energy, high pleasantness emotions like peace or chill or calm, relaxation, gratitude. And again, I love how this visual elegantly communicates so much about what each of these emotional vocabulary words mean by putting them each in terms of those two factors, how much energy is behind them and how much pleasantness is behind them. It doesn't just categorize these emotional vocabulary words into those 4 buckets or quadrants that I described, with the red, yellow, green, and blue. It doesn't just do that, it also tells students about the intensity of each of those words. And this is not an easy thing to describe on an audio medium like a podcast, so I apologize. But for example, in the red quadrant that I described, which is high energy, low pleasantness emotions like anger, frustration, rage, there's a light red part to that, which is the lowest intensity part, where words like worried might go. But then when you get to the furthest edge, the outer corner, it's a darker red, and that's where something like rage would go. So just by where things are positioned on that mood meter, it just tells you so much about how intense they are and how they relate to each other. And again, without rote memorization of the definitions, it helps you understand this emotional vocabulary and feel more proficient in it.
Right. So that's the Yale mood meter. The second visual we'll talk about is the zones of regulation. So this is superficially similar to the mood meter because it also has 4 boxes or zones or buckets of emotions. Like mood meter, they are blue, green, yellow, and red. So what's different about the zones of regulation is they don't have the dimensions of energy and pleasantness. The zones basically just organize things around energy or alertness, and pleasantness isn't much of a factor. So the blue zone is very low alertness, feelings like tired, sad, bored. Next is the green zone, which is low alertness feelings like happy, calm, or focused. Then the yellow zone is high alertness feelings like excited, worried, or frustrated. And finally, the red zone is those very high alertness feelings like terrified, mad, or elated. In those examples, especially with the yellow and the red zone, you can see that emotions with very different degrees of pleasantness, like being terrified or elated, get grouped into the same bucket or zone. They have a similar level of energy or alertness, but those emotions are very different.
Right. So, we talked about the mood meter a minute ago where alertness or energy is one axis, one part of it, and then pleasantness is the other. And I think the simplest way of talking about how the mood meter and zones relate to each other is that zones does kind of collapse the pleasantness, and just kind of regardless of how pleasant an emotion is, if it's a similar level of alertness, like being elated and being mad are similar energy alertness levels, and they get kind of grouped together into one zone. So it's not as complicated as mood meter. And I appreciate all the visuals that we're talking about today. And I've personally used every one of them in different schools that I've worked at. So mood meter, I've also used zones. But I would say, based on my own personal experience, is that even though the folks who developed the zones of regulation visual and that program and that curriculum, they say that it's usable up through 12th grade, if I recall correctly. But personally, I found that it's the best match in the early childhood level and very early elementary grade level, and with students with low incidence disabilities, for example, students on the autism spectrum who have very limited verbal expression. So for those students, the very simple idea of, hey, there are these 4 buckets of feelings, it's easy for them to grasp, and once they get it, I could ask, like, what zone are you in? And hearing back something like, I'm feeling happy, I'm in the green zone. Like, that's very, very simple, and it works well, in my experience, for those very low grade levels and for students with the limited verbal expression. However, I would say that once you get past those very early grade levels, my personal preference would be the mood meter, because it communicates more about what the emotion words mean, and it's especially helpful once students start to learn a lot more different words and a more advanced emotional vocabulary once we get past those very basic terms, to be able to arrange them on the mood meter and have it tell you more about, their energy level versus their pleasantness, versus kind of just clumping a lot of things into those 4 zones, and it doesn't tell you as much about the words.
Yeah, and a third visual we're going to talk about is the 5-point scale. This is literally just a scale from 1 to 5 that maps out the intensity of something. So the best visual I can share via podcast for this would be, those paint samples you get at a hardware store that go from like the lighter shade of something to that darker shade. That's what a 5-point scale should look like. You're not going to give kids a comprehensive map of all emotions with the 5-point scale. It's basically just biting off a little chunk of the mood meter or the zones of regulation and just focusing on arranging the words to tell students which ones are more intense and which ones are less intense. So you could make a 5-point scale for anger that goes from 1 being calm to 5 being enraged. A blue 5-point scale for sadness that goes from 1 being down to 5 being despair. And then you can make a yellow 5-point scale for joy that goes from 1 pleasantness to 5 ecstatic. You can also make 5-point scales for non-emotional concepts, like the size of a problem, for instance. In some of the teams that the 3 of us participate in, we came up with a 5-point scale for consensus. You get the idea.
Yeah, so it's a really flexible tool, and I like what you said, Rye, about it just kind of biting off a little chunk of the mood meter or the zones of regulation, because the 5-point scale really isn't meant to comprehensively cover or help us teach or communicate about all the emotions at once. It's just taking a little bit and making a small little 5-point intensity scale for whatever chunk we bite off: sadness, joy, anger, stress, whatever it is. So before we move on to answering the question, how do we use these tools in schools? I didn't mean to rhyme there. We're going to talk about one more emotion visual. So if you Google emotion wheel, you'll see hundreds of similar examples. So it's a circle with 3 rings inside of it. So the innermost ring, right at the center, typically is 5 to 7 sections. So little spokes, and then there's 5 to 7 little sections of that wheel. And each one is a core emotion word, like happy, sad, disgusted, angry, those very core words. And each one is typically a different color. So then the middle ring, the second one out from that center, breaks each one of those core emotion words. Each one is broken into 4 to 10 more complicated vocabulary words. So instead of sad, which would be one of those sections at the center, we get lonely, guilty, depressed, hurt, etc. So it breaks it out into more complicated words. And then the outermost ring just splits each of those more complex words into even more complex words. So what you get in total is a circle with these different colored sections, and you can start from something basic like happy, and then drill down, or more specifically drill outward, and pick one of the many more complicated emotional vocabulary words that fall into that broad category of happy. So from my description, maybe you recognize these, or maybe you're going to Google emotion wheel, but when you see it, whether it's new to you or whether you recognize it, like these are great tools. I think they're useful for vocabulary building. And if circling back to that kind of being a good writer, being able to understand vocabulary words, like if I'm writing an essay and if I'm picking out words and I'm like, well, I think the character is generally sad, but I don't want to use that word. What other words can I use? Like, they're great for that purpose. But I think one thing they don't do on their own is tell us much about what it's like to experience any of those words. So for example, if I see the word enraged on the mood meter, that tool we talked about from Yale, just by where it is on the mood meter in relation to the word frustrated, for example, I can tell that enraged is a less pleasant and a high energy emotion than being frustrated. So I can tell something about what it's like to experience each of those words without having the dictionary definition at hand or accessible to me. And I'm not going to get that kind of information from the emotions wheel, because it's just not set up to communicate much about what the words actually mean, apart from just saying like, hey, these are different kinds of sadness. If that makes sense. It's a hard thing to describe.
So most of this episode has been about these different kinds of tools, but before we go, we're going to talk about how these can be used in schools to build emotional intelligence. So one pretty obvious way we use these is during explicit SEL instruction, and that is the standalone SEL lesson that we deliver using curriculums like Second Step or our Be Good People curriculum. Almost always these curriculums are going to have lessons or units that teach kids how to name their own emotions and to recognize emotions in others. That's often where a student would have one of these visuals introduced to them and explained, but think about instructional time.
Yeah, Tier 1, we might be talking about a handful of 20-minute lessons per year that really focus on this piece of SEL, that piece of building emotional vocabulary. So that isn't going to cut it on its own, and that circles us back to the beginning of the episode, the dialogue we had about, hey, we're emotional creatures. This is a core part of the human experience for those of us who aren't Vulcans or Terminators, that is. So emotions are part of students' everyday lives. They're part of the literature we read. They're part of other parts of the curriculum.
So let's talk about how these visuals can be used day to day. So in an elementary classroom, you might see a large visual of the mood meter or the zones of regulation on the classroom wall. It could be made of construction paper and kids can attach sticky notes to it. It could be a fancy vinyl deal with plastic slots to put emotion words into it. And it could be a felt cloth that we Velcro pictures or words onto it. Whatever it's made of, expensive or essentially free, it's there for us to reference. So we might be reading my favorite story example, like the Three Little Pigs. And when we pause and ask students questions, we can ask, how do you think the pig felt after his house of sticks got blown down? And students might look at our mood meter and have a few words to pick from. They might choose worried or nervous, frightened, scared, frustrated. But if we're reading about Harriet Tubman during social studies class, we might also reference the mood meter. You know, if she thought she was about to get caught while shepherding slaves to freedom on the Underground Railroad, how do you think she felt? What about when she reached a free state? How do you think she and the people she was traveling with felt? Joy? Ecstatic? Thrilled?
Right, and aside from those examples of how this learning can be embedded into the academic curriculum, let's also talk about check-ins. So you might do proactive, scheduled, routine check-ins with all students. So, for example, every student might have a card with their name on it, and at the beginning of the day, they go up to the mood meter, wherever it's hung in the classroom, and pin it or Velcro it to show where their mood is. You might repeat the same ritual after lunch. And one concern you might be thinking of is, students would be too embarrassed to do that. And there's a few things to say there, but one is that the more we do this, the more normalized it is. So if we want emotionally intelligent kids with a strong skill set at recognizing their emotions, labeling them, dealing with them in a healthy way, we do have to start that dialogue early in their school careers and make it a normal thing to have a dialogue about. So teaching them that it's okay to feel any of these emotions, it's okay to feel any emotion, and you can model checking in yourself as the instructor.
Right, and doing these proactive ritual check-ins also makes life a lot easier when kids are in distress, when they're upset, when they may be shouting or shutting down. If we're getting students used to communicating about their emotions during normal, calm routines, it's a lot easier to expect them to be successful with it when they're not doing great.
Yeah, and we won't dive into it deep right now for the sake of time, but the elementary parts of both the second step curriculum and our own Be Good People curriculum, they both teach students to stop, name their feeling, and then calm down using one of their calm down tools or calm down strategies. So name your feeling is part of that calm down routine in both major curriculums. So recently I've been working with a few elementary schools who use Second Step or who use our Be Good People curriculum. We've been making these small little lanyards teachers can wear that they can use to help coach students when the students are upset, to coach them through that calm down routine. And one of the pieces that we're including on that little lanyard is a picture of the mood meter to help students name their feelings, which again is part of regulating. So really hammering this point home, but I would expect, and it's logical, and it's been my experience, that any student is going to be more comfortable and successful regulating when they're in trouble if I've proactively taught them that routine of naming their feeling when they don't quote unquote need to. You know, if we practice it during those calm ritual routines and we make it normal to have that dialogue about naming our feelings, it's a lot easier to expect them to be successful with it when they're struggling.
Yeah, so we've been talking a lot about elementary students, but before we wrap this episode up, let's talk about how this can look in a middle school or a high school setting. Broadly speaking, I would say the student-by-student check-ins are not as common, but you still might see a large mood meter poster on a classroom wall. Students are less likely to be pinning their names on it or to physically interact with it on a day-to-day basis, but you might see it pointed to and referenced during literature instruction when we're talking to students about current events, etc.
Yeah, and speaking of literature instruction, when students are answering questions about a chapter book they're reading, or if they're writing their own essays, you could provide a handout of emotional vocabulary words. So you could literally give students a list, like, just word after word of emotional vocabulary words that they could pull from when they're writing, for example. But you could also give that to them on the mood meter. So give them the same words you would be giving them, but put them on the mood meter. And that would be an age-appropriate tool to support their emotional intelligence while helping them be insightful readers and be better writers. So again, there's so many good examples of how this is already a part of our day-to-day life and it's part of the curriculum content. So it's fairly easy to embed this learning into the content that we're already teaching. So we're going to talk takeaways. So a big takeaway about the why here and why are we talking about this is that emotion is part of our physiology. So it's a core part of being a human being. We're emotional creatures. So it's part of our day-to-day life, regardless of how much we choose to recognize that. And really what's up to us then is how well we prepare the next generation to be emotionally intelligent, to be able to recognize their emotions and respond to them with intention rather than being so much passively influenced and controlled by their emotions, by those hormones that are rushing through their brains and their bodies. So we have a lot of ways to build students' emotional vocabularies, and we have simple lists of vocab words and those emotion wheels we talked about, tools that have a lot of content, but they don't inherently communicate much of anything about the meaning of the words. And then we shared a few examples of tools that do share more of that meaning about each word. So one we talked about was the zones of regulation, which breaks up emotions into 4 buckets or categories or zones, whatever you want to call them, based on how much energy and alertness is behind each of those words. Then we also talked about the 5-point scale, which is kind of a Swiss Army knife that allows us to really focus in on a small part of our emotional experience, like focusing in on joy, or focusing in on sadness, or focusing in on anger, for example. So taking a little piece and arranging 5 words by how intense they are. So for example, 1 could be calm all the way up to 5, which would be rage. So that would be like an anger 5-point scale. And finally, we talked about Yale University's mood meter, which is a very elegant tool that we're huge fans of because compared to what we just talked about, it's kind of the best of both worlds. It helps students understand what an emotion is by communicating how much energy is behind it and how much pleasantness is behind it, those 2 metrics. And by doing this, it helps students understand the intensity of the emotion word, whatever it is, so they can grasp, the idea that ecstatic is more intense than happy. Just by looking at where those 2 words are on the mood meter, they can grasp that. And finally, we talked about how these tools are used day to day. So we often introduce these tools during standalone SEL instruction, but it's much better if we then use them every day and refer to them during conversations about literature and social studies. And we can also do routine check-ins with students on their mood, like at the beginning of the day or after lunch. And finally, we can coach kids at identifying their emotions when they're in distress and they need help to regulate. And finally, one thing we didn't mention in the episode thus far is really this work is most impactful when it happens at the school-wide level. So yeah, it is great. It's always great if one teacher decides to build emotional intelligence using one of these tools in their own classroom. But overall, it's easier on students and it's much more impactful if all the adults in one school building are getting on the same page. Like, hey, as a building, we're deciding we're going to teach students about the mood meter during their SEL instruction. And then when they go to the stop and think room, the staff there are also going to reference the mood meter, et cetera, et cetera. So when all the adults are on the same page, it's easier on the adults and it's easier on the students. So Courtney and Rye work primarily at Tier 3 and the SPED level, while I work, coming at it from the core level. And one thing we've been talking about more and more these days is helping schools with that kind of building-wide alignment, because that's the brass ring of efficiency and learning and communication. That's where we really want to be, is all that alignment around these kind of tools that we can use to support emotional intelligence.
Thanks for that great summary, Nick. And thank you, listeners, for spending time with us today. Make sure to subscribe, and if you're on YouTube, click the bell so that you're notified when new episodes are released each week. We'll see you when you come back for another slice of SEL.
Thanks, guys. Bye.